It's an election year, and politicians on both sides of the aisle are lamenting the forecast of the U.S. economy. They say the expected growth rate of 2.4% through the first quarter of 2017 is way too low. They point out that it's nowhere near the growth of the 1970s and 80s, which was nearer to 4%. Technically, they are right, but it is misleading. At best, they are uninformed. They are correct. U.S. gross domestic product is low compared to the 1970s and 1980s. But it's not the fault of the Republicans, nor the Democrats. It's not about politics, it's demographics. Growth in the U.S. economy is driven by this simple math equation. The change in productivity plus the change in the labor force equals the growth of the gross domestic product. The sum of these two is equal to this. Productivity is driven by automation, technology, and improved work methods. In its official forecast, the government says it expects productivity gains of 1.8% annually through 2024. In the 6+ decades of the post-war era, the growth in productivity has slowed from more than 3% to 1.8%. However, lower productivity growth has accounted for only a small part of the weak recovery since the Great Recession ended in 2009. The main cause of slower GDP growth in recent years has been the baby boom's effect on the age of the labor force. Fewer people entering the labor force puts a cap on GDP growth. GDP growth and the growth in the labor force are connected. Growth in the labor force surged in 1955, and the U.S. economic growth rate hit an astronomical 7.1%. Over the last 6 decades, as the labor force growth rate has slowed, the annual rate of GDP growth has slowed with it. Since the 1970s, growth in the labor force has gradually slowed. Today, the government's 10-year forecasted labor force growth rate of 0.5% explains the slower GDP rate of growth. When you add up the 10-year expected growth in the labor force of 0.5% annually and the 10-year forecast of 1.8% growth in productivity, you get the 2.3% GDP growth rate expected over the coming 10 years. That is the U.S. economy's maximum rated economic speed. In early August, the Wall Street Journal surveyed approximately 70 economists on their quarterly GDP growth forecast through the first quarter of 2017. The consensus forecast is illustrated in this chart. Strength in the rate of GDP growth for the quarters immediately ahead is expected to come in at 2.4%. It's not reasonable to assume that the U.S. economy is capable of sustaining GDP growth much in excess of 2.3% in the quarters and years ahead, despite what you will hear in this election cycle. This is simply a matter of GDP growth arithmetic. The bottom line is that the economy simply cannot sustain the faster growth rate of previous decades, given today's fundamental growth drivers. To expect a sustained return of 3 or 4% annual growth is just not realistic. At 2.3%, the annual growth of U.S. GDP is running at its full calculated potential. It's not so bad after all.